Good evening, everyone. This is Julian Arcila, and today I will talk about my research project that is about the role of the L1 in the field classroom at primary level. During the last 30 years, bilingual education has changed since the implementation of the communicative approach in the early 70s, and teachers, researchers, and stakeholders have always been looking for the next step in terms of bilingualism: what is good, how to implement it, and how to assess it. In the 90s, the term CLIL was introduced by March, referring to diverse methodologies that lead to dual-focus education in which attention is given to both topic and language of instruction. According to Wolf 2007, even though much research has been carried out in Europe and in some other parts of the world measuring CLIL's impact and disadvantages, it seems to be still in its infancy. Due to multiple contexts in which it has been applied, the huge diversity in the samples and teaching techniques in bilingual education research that sometimes offer more noise than signal, making it difficult to discern until what extent is clearly real beneficial or why it seems to be better than other approaches. In Colombia, the scene seems less promising than in Europe, since research presents the same shortcomings and flaws than those from Europe, plus the lack of information about the number of schools working on the CLIL policies or longitudinal studies that can support how CLIL has impacted the Colombian bilingual context. According to Perez Cañado 2012, there is a lack of research in topics such as linguistical outcomes, assessment in language acquisition, as well as in content learning, effects of CLIL on L1 and L2 development, CLIL methodology, and teacher training, without mentioning the lack of longitudinal studies. Additionally, previous research has shown shortcomings and flaws, such as the lack of homogeneity in the samples, the low number of variants, such as verbal intelligence, motivation, or socio-cultural status, and the development of L1 and content knowledge as dependent variables. And finally, the absence of statistical information to show and reinforce clear results. This led me to the conclusion that there is a need to research on the real role of the L1, especially at primary level, where there is even less research, as there has always been the misconception that CLIL can only be implemented once the students have learned to read and write. My research question is focused on the use of the L1. What is the role of the mother tongue in the CLIL classroom at primary level, and why it seems to be an underappreciated tool to scaffold knowledge? In order to answer this question, my research project can achieve the following objectives: to identify the number of institutions working on their CLIL policies and the type of CLIL that is implemented, to identify the main functions of the mother tongue in the CLIL classroom, to create a list of situations in which it's completely understandable to rely on the L1 in the CLIL classroom, to identify the main elements that deter the implementation of the L1 in the CLIL classroom, keeping in mind different roles and policies, and finally to identify a direct relation between the native speakerism and the lack of use of the mother tongue in the CLIL classroom. So far, I have identified two constructs in my research project, and I am not sure if I want to add one more, as it probably will demand more tools or time. The first one is first language reliability, and the second one L1 linguistic functions in L2 acquisition. In order to collect the data for this mixed method research, I have gone for the following instruments: questionnaire, interview, and observation. The first one is the questionnaire. It looks for opinions of individuals in a population on issues related to the objective of the research. I have thought to implement them with structured and unstructured questions. Advantages: anonymity, and it facilitates the collection of large amount of data. Disadvantages: confusing and misleading questions, as researchers are not present to explain the questions, and questions sometimes tend to be difficult to understand. Then we have the interview. The interview is an oral questionnaire. The researcher prepares structured questions before meeting the interviewee. Advantages: it has a high response rate, and the personal interaction allows the researcher to explain confusing questions. On the other hand, we got the disadvantages, and one of them is the researcher's bias. In addition to this, the amount of data can be that can be collected is limited. Finally, we have the observation. With this instrument, an individual behavior or situation is observed and recorded. For the purpose of my research, I will go for a no-participant observation. The advantages: it is studies free of bias, it gives us first-hand information, and we can count on reliable results. However, it has problems with inaccuracy, as the observer may not understand completely what is happening in the activity. Delay results, and the observer's presence is likely to affect the validity of the behavior observed. I decided to choose these instruments as previous research on the same topics used them. For instance, Schreiber's 1999 created different questionnaires to identify the use of the Spanish in the ESL classroom. Macaro 2001 observed 14 video-recorded lessons and implemented unstructured questionnaires in order to identify the quantity of use of the L1 in the foreign language classroom. And finally, Lester-Buster 2013 gathered his data based on a workshop and a questionnaire about the coexistence of the L1 and the L2 in CLIL classes with 35 teachers. Most of the research aimed to collect data from one specific group of participants. However, I think that in order to have a more real approximation of the real role of the L1 in the CLIL classroom, it is necessary to consider actors such as scale holders, coordinators, teachers, and even students.